Very often when I'm a tour guide at the city of Milwaukee, people will make the comment to me at the end of the tour that working on a boat like this just doesn't look safe because they go down in the machinery spaces, they see all the open machinery and the parts that could hurt you, or they go up onto the car deck and they see the freight cars that we have there and the openness and all the bad stuff that's on the car deck, and they think that this just really isn't safe. Well, the car ferry operation was really a very safe endeavor for the amount of years that they were in business. They made hundreds of thousands of trips across the lake, carried millions of tons of freight and millions of passengers with very few major accidents or loss of life. Not that the accidents didn't happen, but it really was a safe operation in terms of volume of trips and people carried over the years. The Ann Arbor number 4 was lucky. Today we're going to talk about some boats that weren't so lucky. So this is just a short video on a typical day on Lake Michigan at Frankfort. You could see waves coming over the north wall. It looks, pretty severe, but back in the day, the boats would go out in this. This was, a rough crossing to them, but this isn't something that would cause them any concern that they would lose the boat or they would sink or anything like that. To us here, that we live here, this is really just a commonplace day, a common winter day on Lake Michigan. And if you were out on the lake on a day like that, on a boat, on a car ferry, it might look something like this. This is the Pere Marquette 17, which will factor into our talk later. And you could see that she's pitching pretty heavily in this picture, and the seas look heavy, but actually they were not. This is called an old sea, and this was not the beginning of the storm. This was the tail end of a storm, which we'll talk about later too. This was really just another day on this boat, and the boats would deal with this type of weather all the time. Last year, we talked about the Ann Arbor number 4, about she was a lucky boat that had a very long career, 73 years, and she escaped mishaps, especially this one in 1923 when she sank at the entrance of Frankfort Harbor. And it easily could have gone the other way for her, but it didn't. But today we're going to talk about 3 boats that were not so lucky. The first one is the Marquette and Bessemer number 2, which ran on Lake Erie. In the early part of the century, these boats primarily carried a lot of raw materials from one point to another. The number 2 was built to basically carry coal from the eastern coal fields of Pennsylvania and Kentucky up to southern Canada. That was her job. She had limited passenger accommodations. And you'll notice one thing about these boats is that they were all built about the same time. In the early part of the 1900s, the car ferry operation was expanding rapidly. They were carrying a lot more freight. They started to carry passengers. They figured out it was a viable way to move raw materials and commodities and people, and that is what the number 2, the M&B number 2, did at this time. She ran from Conneaut, Ohio to Port Stanley, Ontario. She'd make 1 trip a day, taking loaded cars one way and bringing empty cars back the other way. her captain, Robert McLeod, is in the inset of this picture. Robert McLeod was one of 5 brothers who all served on the Great Lakes. He's the one in the lower left of this picture. His brother John is standing above his shoulder there, the guy with the mustache. He was also a captain, but he would serve with his brother very often on the same boat. So you had 2 captains on the same boat, John and Robert McLeod. The M&B number 2 is seen here on a trip leaving Conneaut Harbor for Port Stanley. You can see her hull was painted green. There were some other boats that were painted green as well. They weren't all black. But also notice the open stern on the number 2, which would prove to be an Achilles heel of the car ferry operation for many, many years. And the operators of these boats would deal with this for almost the whole history of the car ferries, protecting the stern against the severity of the weather. Another picture of the number 2 sitting in her dock. On December 7th, 1909, she left Conneaut on what was to be one of her last trips of the year. A month before, Captain McLeod had complained to the operator of this boat that they needed to do something about the open stern, because at one point she had taken a 10-foot wall of water into the stern and almost capsized the boat. And they promised him at the time that, yes, we will take her out of service at the end of December and we will address this problem. But they never got the chance, because on the morning of December 7th, 1909, she left Conneaut with 30 cars, 27 cars of coal and 3 cars of steel, and headed for Port Stanley, and she was never seen again. She left in what was reportedly were 50-knot winds, which is unusual in itself. And also, she was delayed for 3 hours in her departure from Conneaut because the freighter had blown against the sidewall of the harbor and blocked the channel. The normal crossing time from Conneaut to Port Stanley was about 5 hours. And if she had left on time, she may have been able to complete this journey safely. As it was, her 3-hour delay may have contributed in the loss of the boat, but we don't know. She left, the wind increased to 75 knots that afternoon out on Lake Erie. And we don't really know what her course was, because that night on December 7th, there were conflicting reports of seeing the boat on both sides of Lake Erie. So when she went to Port Stanley there, you can see the dotted line. At 2 in the morning, there were reports that people heard her whistle off of Port Stanley. But then 2 hours later, off of Conneaut, people reported seeing her heading straight for the harbor based on her navigation lights. And it's impossible that she could have been in both places at the same time. So we don't really know what her course was, but we do know that at some point during the night of the 7th or the morning of the 8th or any time during the 8th, is that she went down. The speculation is that she turned and headed east for the shelter of Long Point there for some protection against the wind. The Marquette and Bessemer number 2 is a true ghost ship. The wreck has never been found. People are looking for the wreck to this day. It's one of the only wrecks, the major wrecks, that haven't been found on the Great Lakes, and especially with the improved technology that we have in diving, they can find shipwrecks at 22,000 feet now. And at this point in Lake Erie, it's not much more than 200 feet deep. It's speculated that she may have sunk into the soft mud at the bottom of the lake, and that's why the wreck has not been found. But we don't know what her course was or where she went down. Very soon after she was reported missing, her operator put an ad in the paper asking for any information about if you had seen the boat or if you had anything at all about where her location was. And if you had credible information and you brought it to the office, they'd pay you $500. But she was reported missing, and there was actually another boat that was reported missing at that same time, the Clarion. This was a bad storm on Lake Erie. But the car ferry seemed to be more of a concern. She also had a sister ship, the number 1, which had made her trip back and forth across Lake Erie and reported not seeing anything of the number 2, and concern was growing about her whereabouts. Until the 9th, when a freighter was passing through a large field of wreckage in the middle of Lake Erie, and they saw some white painted upperworks and some other debris in the lake. And then they spotted a lifeboat floating in Lake Erie that had 9 people in it. And it was the number 4 lifeboat from the M&B number 2. And they radioed back to Conneaut, and a government fishing vessel came out and put a line on the lifeboat and towed her back to Conneaut. The men had died from exposure, and when they brought the boat back, they actually had to thaw them out to get them out and identify them. This is the number 4 lifeboat where they found the 9 men. You could see the damage on the side of the boat, which may or may not indicate that they had some trouble launching these boats, getting them into the water. All the men were dressed in one form or another, but clearly they weren't really dressed for the weather, and being dressed for the weather out in an open boat like this in Lake Erie in December doesn't really mean anything anyway. The 9 men were brought to the morgue. They worked in varying departments on the boat. Some were in the engine room, some were in the galley. Clearly, they knew that they were going down, and also they did have time to launch their boats. All 4 lifeboats from the Marquette and Bessemer number 2 were eventually recovered. But like I said just a minute ago, that your chances of survival in a boat like this, in a storm like this, were not very good. So the chief steward, who is in this picture, also had a collection of his galley knives with him in the boat, which started some speculation that there might have even been a mutiny against the captain at this time, that the crew was blaming the captain for the loss of the vessel, but that was never proved. The captain's body, when it was recovered, did have some slash marks on it, but it was not determined that these came from a knife. The number 2 lifeboat, which was also picked up, and you can also see that there is some damage on the side as it was torn away from the boat. These boats were these boats actually were metallic at the time, which was kind of unusual. Most of the lifeboats at this time were made out of wood, and they have a flotation tank at each end to keep it from sinking. And like I said, all 4 lifeboats were recovered from the M&B number 2, but not many more people after the 9 unfortunate people in the number 4 lifeboat. Slowly, the people started to come to shore. John McLeod's body was found early in 1910 over by the Niagara Falls Power Station. He also was frozen in ice, and they had to thaw him out to get positive identification. His brother Robert McLeod was also picked up off of Long Point, which may have indicated the wreck was in the vicinity of Long Point. He was picked up as well. Now, so should she have gone out? Probably not. It's hard to say. I mean, these guys were experienced mariners. They took chances, sure, but they were under pressure from the company also to keep up their schedule. And this is something I also tell people at the city of Milwaukee is that this is the way the company made money, was the number of trips and the amount of freight that they were able to carry back and forth across the lake. And most of these captains were pretty cautious. And if they thought that there was a chance that the vessel might be in danger, they'd tie up. You know, some of the boats here in Frankfort would tie up for days at a time until, the storm abated. They were responsible for the boat and the safety of the crew on board. They didn't want anything to happen. So the number 2 sank. We're not sure where she is or what happened. And it is one of the holy grails for Great Lakes shipwreck hunters today. Next, we're going to move on to the Pere Marquette 18. And like I said earlier, almost all these boats were similar in size. They were all built about the same time. They differed mainly by the amount of passengers that they could carry. The 18 was built in 1902 and had extensive passenger accommodations aboard her because the railroad was starting to tap into the passenger traffic that was traveling across the country and mainly here to Michigan or back to Wisconsin.
I don't understand.
She carried a lot of passengers. She had a number of nice staterooms on board that people could take advantage of. And the railroad would take her out of service sometime during the summers and use her for charters down from Waukegan, Illinois to Chicago. They would plank over the car deck and build a large stairway at the stern, which you'll see in a minute, and they would carry passengers back and forth to Chicago. And at Labor Day, they would take her out of service and make her ready for the freight traffic and then send her back to Huntington. The 18 was commanded by Captain Peter Kilty, who was second from right in this picture. Once again, he was a capable seaman. Here are the 4 officers here on the bridge of the number 18. He had been on this vessel, I believe, since it was constructed. And his first mate is standing to his left, who was also a very capable seaman. And they were popular with the crew and with the passengers. The 18 took her spot in the regular rotation of ferries back and forth from Ludington to Milwaukee and Manitowoc. And here she is a little bit more than a year before she was lost, entering Ludington during the winter months. A large stairway was built across the stern, and you could see the passengers up on the top deck of the 18 here. The car deck was used for dancing, and according to some people, it even had some slot machines there. I'm not really sure what the regulations were for gambling back then, but I'm sure that other people tried this as well. The 18 was a popular boat going back before it between Waukegan and Chicago. I mean, there were other boats that did this as well, but this was a way that the railroad could make extra revenue during the summer months, which were typically not as busy with freight service as they were during the winter. Here's the 18 where their direct decks crowded full of passengers, advertising you could take a ride on the boat for 25 cents between Chicago and Waukegan. Another view of the 18 during her excursion service. Labor Day 1910, she was taken out of the excursion service, and the company that ran this had informed the railroad that they were not going to renew the service the next season as it was becoming less and less in its popularity. So they were not going to take the 18 back as an excursion boat in 1911. So she went to Waukegan. She was in Waukegan. They did some maintenance items like getting the car deck ready for freight cars. They took up the planking and some other things that they needed to do to put her back in freight service, gave her a safety certificate, and sent her back to Ludington. On September 9th at 11:30 p.m., she left Ludington with a full load of freight cars and 55 passengers. Included in the passengers were the owner of the excursion company and 4 of his workers, which continued to work in the passenger areas, either laying down carpet or getting everything ready to turn her back over for the railroad. And they left for Milwaukee, which in normal conditions would be about a 6-hour trip. The seas weren't especially rough at this time, but there was a pretty good swell coming in from the northwest. About 2 in the morning, the 18, an officer from the 18 went into the aft compartment and found that she was filling up with water. Under the car deck towards the stern of the boat is where the unlicensed engine room crew has their sleeping quarters called the flicker. And he found that the water had come up almost to the base of the flicker, and it was gaining on the boat when he found this. He called the mate on watch, and they went back and they found some open portholes that were towards the stern of the boat, and they managed to get those closed. But the water continued to gain on the boat, and they didn't know why. And they woke up the captain, who was asleep at the time, and he came up and turned the boat almost due south and ordered the crew to start jettisoning the freight cars off the car deck to lighten the weight on the boat. This was no easy feat for any car ferry crew, but they did manage to shove 13 cars off the stern of the 18. But what they found is it didn't really make any difference. And the water continued to gain on the ship, and the pumps were working, but they didn't know where the water was coming from. And after they managed to get the cars off the boat, they turned and headed due east for Wisconsin. And they also started to send out a CQD signal, a distress call, saying that they were in trouble, and this is the Pere Marquette 18, we're sinking, please help us. At 2:30 in the morning, the Pere Marquette 17 had left Milwaukee, bound for Ludington, and she was in the general area of where the 18 was. She picked up the distress call and headed for the 17. When they got there, they could see that the boat had her flags upside down, which is a symbol of distress. And they made preparations to save who was ever on the boat. But at this point, the captain still thought that he could save the boat. And he had not ordered abandoned ship. He was later criticized for that. And there were still people on boat that thought that they were going to make it. And we have a letter in our possession that was written by the first mate on the Pere Marquette 17 as they pulled up next to the 18 to commence the rescue operations. And Jane Perkis is going to share that letter with us today. And it's an eyewitness account of what he saw that afternoon or that morning.
Thanks, Tim. He wrote this letter to his sister. Ludington, September 11th, 1910. Dear sister, it's been quite a while since I've written to you, and now I have some interesting news. You probably heard about the PM-18 going down and drowning 29 of the crew. Well, we were there and saw it all. It was an awful sight to see them jump off her and jump into the water. We were on the way from Milwaukee to Ludington. We left Milwaukee at 3:22 a.m., and when I came on watch at 6:15 a.m., I saw a car ferry. Oh, but didn't think anything of seeing a car ferry. We meet those every day. I went down below on the car deck and came up again in about 10 minutes and looked at her again. And then I saw she had 2 flags up. And then I discovered that she was in trouble. I headed right for her and then called the captain. We were about 6 or 7 miles from her. When we got within 4 miles of her, we saw that her stern was low and kept getting lower all the time. I called the wireless operator up, but the operator of the 18 was too fast, and our operator couldn't get anything out of it. The papers state that when we got the message to go out to the 18, but we never did. We finally got to her about 7:10 or 7:15 or somewhere along there, and we could notice her stern gradually going down. The people had life preservers on, and they had 3 lifeboats down. One of them was full of water, and a few of the people were getting into them. We ran alongside of her pretty close, and we were going by her, and they all yelled out to stop, back up, and etc. It was only about half a minute, then she started to go down fast. Her stern went down first, her bow went up, and before she disappeared, she was almost end to end. The pressure of the air in the boat and the cabin blew the roof off, and those that were in it hurled up into the air and were probably killed before they landed in the water. The captain of the 18 was one of them. While this was going on, we started to get our boats ready. The first mate and I were on one boat getting it ready, and he left me and went to the forward boat. And after I got the after boat over, 4 of us got into it. The 2 watchmen and a deckhand, who was Jacob Jacobson from Ludington, and my watchman's name was Joe Peterson. Well, everything looked all right to lower, and we no more than got down to the water, and the car ferry started to swing and washed us completely out of the boat. We all tried to hang on to the lifeboat, but could not do a thing but go with the waves, and we all disappeared from the car ferry. They all thought we were gone for sure. The luckiest thing that was, we had about 8 extra life preservers in the boat, and they floated out with us, and I grabbed 3 of them. I just missed the wheel. I was going straight right for it, but it was just luck that a sea came along and raised me over it, and the wheel was working too. The car ferry did not stop for us. She went over to the 18 crew. I hung on to the life preservers for about half an hour, and I started to get cold. I thought I better try to put one of them on me. I got 2 of them on me just to make sure a sure thing. I finally made up my mind I had to do something, and I started to swim for the 17. I guess I swam for about half an hour and could see that they had 2 lifeboats down picking up the 18 crew. I started to feel all right then. When I saw them, I kept on paddling and finally got near enough so they could see me, and they came and picked me up. They no more than got me in the boat when they saw the watchman. He could not have been more than 200 feet from me all the time, and I could not see him. They had almost all the live ones off the 18 picked up when they got me. One of the fellows in the boat got crazy. He was grabbing everything he could get hold of. 2 firemen, 1 oiler, and the 3 engineers went down with the 18. I knew 2 of the engineers. The first assistant was married to Ann Nelson of Northport, and he was on the Manistee for a long time. We took all the survivors and the 6 dead bodies with us to Ludington. I've been home since then, but I think I'll go down tonight when the 17 gets in. The watchman that got drowned was Joe Peterson. He started decking on the 17 when we came out of the shipyard a year ago last spring. And last April, he started in on my watch. The other fellow, Jacob Jacobson, came over from Norway last summer, a young fellow about 18 years old, and he sent his father and mother $10 every month to Norway. He also has a brother, only about half a block from here. Well, I must close. The 17 is just coming in. Hello from Laura, your brother, Eston.
Thanks, Jane. Eston Bailey was originally from Sutton's Bay, and the Bailey family still has a presence up in Sutton's Bay, that same family. So you see the heroism here of one man almost sacrificing his life to try and go and save others that were in peril. These were brave men who would do anything for their shipmates if they saw them in peril. He would go on to become a captain with the Pere Marquette Railroad and would serve as a captain. He died in 1946. He started as a wheelsman on the Milwaukee in 1905, and we'll touch on that in just a minute. The sinking of the 18, big deal. There have been 2 car ferries lost now within a year, and it got the attention of Popular Mechanics magazine, who attempted to explain why the 18 went down, and they had a very long article in the November 1910 issue of Popular Mechanics explaining their theories. Here's another stylized picture of the boat actually sinking. The seas would have been rougher than this, and it's likely that you wouldn't see a freight car floating in the water next to the boat. But you can also see the 17 on the horizon coming to the rescue, and the lifeboat filled with passengers, which also probably didn't happen. I mean, there were people in the boats, but you could see it seemed pretty orderly here with getting the people off the boat, which wasn't the case. They went through the magazine and provided some diagrams about how the boats were constructed in general and how where the departments were where she took on water. You could see the flicker that I mentioned there at the far left part of the boat under the car deck, which is where they discovered the water to begin with. Once again, it was big news. It was reported in Chicago, all around Michigan. Once again, you know, this is the second boat that they had lost in under a year, and so it got the attention of many people. Once again, here's a diagram showing some of the schematics of the boat, including how they moved the freight cars to the stern and off the open stern into the lake. The wreck of the 18 was found in 2020. Her stern is in 500 feet of water, and her bow is sticking up in 400 feet of water. So she's torpedoed into the lake bed at an angle about like this. This had been another of the long sought after shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, and the hull is in pretty bad shape. She collapsed, she kind of folded in because of the air pressure coming out of the hull. Her pilot house slid down the deck and is towards the stern. But the wreck was found, and once again, we'll never know really what happened to her because we don't know why she was taking on all that water all the time, and they couldn't stop it, and they couldn't find why she was doing this. In January 1911, the Ann Arbor number 5 came into Frankfort on her maiden voyage, and she would be the first car ferry that was built with a shipyard installed Seagate. And you could see it across the stern there. The lake operators, especially after the loss of the 18, really decided that they needed to do something about this problem. And when the 18 sank, another boat was ordered by the railroad immediately, also called the Pere Marquette 18. And she would be built in South Chicago in 90 days. And she entered service in March 1911, and she would also have a Seagate on the stern. The next boat we're going to talk about is the Milwaukee. Once again, about the same size, built in 1903, a big boat, a full-length passenger cabin. She was built for service in between Northport and Manistee. The service was never successful. And by 1905, she had entered service as chartered to the other two railroads, especially the Pere Marquette. And later on, she was taken over by the Grand Trunk Railroad, which would operate her out of Grand. But for of 1904, she served out of Frankfort. And because her loading facilities were not yet ready in Northport, she just spent that one summer here in Frankfort sailing. And you could see here she is leaving Betsy Lake. Don't call it Betsy. And she's coming past the Frontenac Hotel there with her builder's pennant, flying from her foremast. And she's basically a brand new boat here after that Northport, but that service was short-lived and was never successful. In her tenure as the Milwaukee, she ran from Grand Haven over to Milwaukee. In 1929, she was commanded by this gentleman, Robert McKay, who was from Scotland. He came here from Scotland. He, once again, was a very experienced captain on the Great Lakes, but he had a bad reputation for going out in almost all kinds of weather. So people would tend to call him Bad Weather Bob or Heavy Weather McKay. He looks like kind of a gruff guy here, and I guess he was, but he was, he was a capable seaman, and he knew the lake. He had been on other shipwrecks on Lake Michigan as well. I mean, one of the boats that he was on caught fire off Milwaukee, and he was credited with having saved a lot of the passengers. The Milwaukee was a sturdy boat, well built, had a lot of power. She had a Seagate retrofitted in 1910 after the loss of the 18, but the issue with her Seagate was that it's not very well constructed. You could see the gate that they put across the stern here. It was 5 feet tall, but not reinforced. Basically, it was just a single piece of steel that hung across the stern, and was not very effective as protection. You have to keep in mind that if you're standing towards the stern of a car ferry, the clearance between the lake and the car deck is not much taller than me. So the water is that close to swamping your boat. And in any kind of heavy seas, they could easily come up over this Seagate and come into the open stern of the boat. On October 22nd, 1929, the Milwaukee came across from Grand Haven to Milwaukee, and running pretty heavily out of the north, but McKay reported that when he got to Milwaukee that the boat had made pretty good time and it wasn't really anything that he hadn't seen before. And when he tied up, there were two other boats in Milwaukee Harbor at the same time, the Grand Rapids and the Pere Marquette 17, which we talked about before. He tied up, and the crew thought that they were not going to make the return trip back to Grand Haven. And two of them even left the boat and went into downtown Milwaukee to take in a movie. They were that sure that the boat would tie up until the weather cleared. But at 3 o'clock that afternoon, Captain K ordered the lines cast off, and he left for Grand Haven with 26 cars aboard. And the boats that were in the harbor at the time really raised their eyebrows at this because they had already decided that they were not going to try and make a return trip. The Milwaukee attempted to go straight across the lake with the seas running almost due north and south. This was the typical heavy weather McKay course, or bad weather Bob, if you prefer. Most times, if they were caught in this situation, they would head into the seas and then turn and take the seas on the quarter and then turn again and cross the lake that way. It took longer, but it was safer. And he attempted to go straight across and started rolling. People to see the boat were the crew on the lightship Milwaukee, which was about 10 miles outside of Milwaukee Harbor. At one point, not too long after this, McKay had figured that he was in for more than he had bargained for. He attempted to turn around and head back to Milwaukee Harbor. This is where the boat ran into much trouble and came to grief only 3 miles from Point, Wisconsin. So she sank only 3 miles offshore, and in good weather, she was only 20 minutes outside of Milwaukee Harbor. But it looks like she attempted to turn north into the seas and then turn again and head back to city of Milwaukee. We have this thing on display called a message case. And it's a brass case with the name of the boat stamped into it, and it's watertight. And when the Milwaukee became overdue, the railroad sent out a plane to go look for it and crisscrossed the lake. They didn't see anything. Started to get concerned about the safety of their boat. And not too long after that, they found a message case which had washed up on the Michigan side of Lake Michigan, similar to this one. And inside was this message. And it says, and this was handwritten by the purser at the time, and he was 24 years old, and he took the time to compose himself and write this message, which says, SS Milwaukee, October 22nd, 1929, 8:30 p.m. Taking water fast, turned around and headed for Milwaukee. Pumps are working, but Seagate is bent and can't keep the water out. Flicker is flooded. Seas are tremendous. Things look bad. Crew roll is about the same as on the last payday, and it was signed A.R. Sadin, purser. This is the actual note that he wrote. It was thought to be lost for many years until it was found again in the National Archives in Chicago by another one of our car ferry guys doing some research down there. He found this note, which had not been viewed for 60 plus years. And this is the actual note that the young man wrote before the boat went down, probably around 9 or 10 o'clock that night. The Milwaukee, 120 feet of water, 3 miles off of Fox Point, Wisconsin. one of the most visited shipwrecks in the Great Lakes because of its relatively shallow depth and accessibility from Milwaukee Harbor. This is a picture of the stern of the Milwaukee with her aforementioned sea gate hanging off of the side of the boat. You can see here that it's bent at a 90-degree angle and was still attached to the boat when she. Much of the speculation was that the freight had gotten loose on the car deck and taken the sea gate along with it when it rushed off the side of the boat. Historical Society did a survey of the wreck about 10 years ago and found that all 26 cars were still on board the car deck. Damage was likely done by the waves of the lake that either hit it sideways or hit it from the back on and caused that damage. At one point, it's speculated that the crew on the Milwaukee had taken one of the freight cars and actually managed to turn it so it was going across the stern to try and keep the water out, and that car is still there. So it all freight aboard, and the sea gate did not do anything to protect them from the seas. Later on, they would find a lifeboat with 4 people in it over towards the Michigan side. They all had life preservers on, stenciled SS Milwaukee. You know, over the next couple of days, it became apparent that the boat had gone down, and the search was started to find bodies or wreckage from the boat. Here is the actual death certificate from Captain McKay, and he was actually set to retire after this year. In this case, the Milwaukee shouldn't have sailed. She should have stayed in Milwaukee Harbor, where, you know, there was no reason for her to go out that day. And it's speculated that actually the railroad had ordered him to come back. We're not really sure. The Milwaukee had been given a safety inspection not too long before this accident. And after she sank, the families of the men that were lost sued the railroad for, you know, a monetary settlement based on the fact that they thought that she wasn't in good sailing order. Okay, and that was under a lot of dispute for at least 10 years after she sank. Eventually, they settled out of court, and the railroad paid the survivors of the men that were lost money. But there still is talk that there were some items of maintenance or safety on the boat that had not been taken care of. When she was missing, it became big news. And also the big news at the time, and you can see on the front page of the paper here, was the state of the economy, which happened on the eve of the Great Depression. But then it became apparent that she was lost when they picked up the body of the captain and the purser, the guy who wrote that note, off of Kenosha. They didn't find a whole lot of people in this. And they found some wreckage, but they didn't get all of the crew. And once again, you could see here that the economy itself was taking over most of the front page of the paper, even if a boat had sunk with all hands just 2 days before and taken 50 men with it. So the recovery operation went on, and this article comes from the Chicago Tribune when they were writing about the recovery operation after the boat sank. The anchor from the Milwaukee is on display at the entrance to Milwaukee Harbor. The wreck was found in 1972, kind of by accident. And the people who found it didn't disclose her whereabouts for many years. And eventually they would, and it became, like I said, one of the most visited wrecks on the Great Lakes. This is one of the anchors that they raised up from the boat. And to end our program, we're going to go back to the first picture was taken during the same storm. This picture was taken on October 24th, 1929. And this is the Pere Marquette 17 on her way back from Milwaukee to Ludington at the end of the storm that claimed the Milwaukee. So she is sailing here through what is referred to as Old Sea. This is the end of that storm, and you could still see how heavy it was. And she's, you could see the height of the wave is almost as tall as the pilot house there. This is one of the boats that stayed in Milwaukee Harbor while the Milwaukee left. And the 17 would go on until she was scrapped in 1961. So that's the end of our program, unless we have any questions.